3 of Agenda 2022, the Pearson Center's fall conference on the priorities of the new Parliament and government should address in 2022 and beyond. My name is Francesca Iacorto, and I'm a board member at the Pearson Center. I am also the Senior Director of Public Affairs of the National Airlines Council of Canada. Let me begin by acknowledging that we are meeting virtually on the lands of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We pay tribute to Indigenous peoples across the country and their ancestors for their tremendous contributions to Canada. As you may know, the Pearson Centre is a leading progressive think tank that addresses the challenging economic and social issues of the day. We are proud to say that we are the only think tank that invites representatives from all federal parties, along with the top business, labor, and civil society leaders, as well as many other experts. As we like to say, we bring people and ideas together. And now, a very special thank you to the donors and sponsors that make all our events possible, especially our sustaining sponsors that include Canada's Building Trades Unions, the International Association of Firefighters, and MFSAO, Ontario's professional employees. And now I'd like to also extend a very special thank you to the gold sponsor for this conference, Bruce Power, as well as to Mr. Charles Coffey. Now, very briefly on the format, we will have a discussion with our guests for about 40 minutes, at which time we will turn the floor over to you, the audience. So please use the question box on your screen, and we will get to as many questions as we can before we wrap up at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Today, we have a very exciting panel of Canadians who work in various fields and have addressed the progressive agenda in different ways. We have with us Frank Baylis, who is the executive chairman of Baylis Medical, a successful company in Montreal. He has received various awards and honors for his impressive entrepreneurial success, as well as his commitment to community service, for which he earned the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal in 2012. He's also a former Liberal MP for the riding of Pierrefonds-Dollard in Montreal and introduced a multi-party motion to improve the operation of the chamber. Also with us is Professor Laurie Turnbull, the director of the School of Public Administration and associate professor of political science at Dalhousie University. Dr. Turnbull's research and teaching focuses on parliamentary democracy and governance, public sector ethics, and democratic reform. Her book, Democratizing the Constitution, Reforming Responsible Government, co-authored with Mark Jarvis and the late Peter Aucoin, won the Donner Prize in 2011 and the Donald Smiley Prize in 2012. Also with us is Eleni Bakopanos, a former Canadian politician who served in the House of Commons from 1993 to 2006. She is a champion for women's full participation in political life and wrote a booklet entitled Political Recruiting and Women in the Political Process. She's a long-standing member of Equal Voice and is also the past chair of its national board. Our moderator today will be Indira Naidu-Harris, who is a co-chair of this conference and also the Associate Vice President of Diversity and Human Rights at the University of Guelph. She was formerly a national broadcaster as well as an Ontario MPP from 2014 to 2018 and served as a cabinet minister in the government of Kathleen Wynne. On that, I will turn the floor over to you, Indira.
Thank you, Francesca, for that lovely introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. I can't tell you how pleased I am to be here with you all today for the Pearson Center's annual conference, Agenda 2022, Priorities for the New Parliament and Government. Today, we will take a look at Parliament in the coming year and the need for constructive politics. You see, experts say politics today is divisive. They say the system is broken. And they point out that social media, mudslinging, video mocking, and harsh ads and tweets are now a regular part of political discourse in Canada. And they say that's not okay. They say this demonizing of the opposition by Canadian parties and politicians is unproductive and toxic and doesn't lead to healthy discussions and solutions, but instead to anger and sometimes rage. So, how can we get things back on track? How can we get Canadian politicians to talk to each other with civility and respect? After all, we are faced with some of the biggest challenges in our history as a result of the global pandemic. And so it's more important now than ever before that our politicians find ways to talk to each other, exchange ideas, and find solutions to our pressing problems. Canadians need leaders who can find ways to work together. After all, how can our government leaders find solutions to some of the most pressing problems of our time when they're too busy attacking each other? Well, our impressive all-party panel joins us now to help us find out some of the answers to some of those questions. So joining me now are, and I'm just going to ask you to raise your hand as I call your name, but Frank Baylis, former MP and executive chairman of Baylis Medical. Also here is Professor Laurie Turnbull, director at the School of Public Administration at Dalhousie University. And Eleni Bakopanos, former MP and now with Equal Voice Canada. Well, welcome everyone. So good to have you here with us today. So I'm going to start with you, Frank Baylis. Can you maybe give us a sense of what do you think right now about politics in Canada? Is it more divisive in recent years? What have been your observations?
I think that we've kind of lost our way along the way is what I think has happened. And over time, certain changes have come into play that have encouraged divisiveness, have encouraged showboating, have encouraged the aggressive behavior, which is really counterproductive and needs to be addressed. And when I was in Parliament, I took on, and I'm sure we'll get to talk about it, a role to try and make changes, bring changes to the government. In fact, in some ways, go back, address new opportunities to go forward in new ways, but also in some ways to go back to what we used to do and how we used to behave. And I think that there's phenomenal opportunity, and also I'd say tremendous will on the part of the vast majority of parliamentarians to be in a better, more cohesive, productive environment. I do sincerely believe that.
Well, very interesting that you also feel that there's a bit of a commitment by folks to be wanting to do that. But in all reality, that doesn't appear to be what we saw, for example, in the last election, and certainly what we're seeing south of the border. I'm going to go next to Professor Turnbull because I'd like to bring you into this conversation. So, Professor Turnbull, tell me, are politics in Canada divisive today, more divisive than usual? What's your sense? I'm sorry, Professor Turnbull, we don't appear to be hearing you.
Aha, I muted myself just to make sure that I wasn't contributing to background noise, and then I overdid it. Okay, so I think that there is something, there's something in the water in Parliament where the parties, even though they agree on a lot, not all of them, right? But like if we look even at this past election, there's so much overlap between the Liberals and the NDP to the point that people are asking questions about whether we actually need the NDP. And so if that's what's happening, then where's the division coming from? And we also saw when the Conservatives, Aaron O'Toole being criticized for pulling more to the center. And so clearly, like there's a kind of competition going on that I think is in some cases more on the basis of brand than it is about completely different values. There's a lot of overlap, I think, across the parties in terms of what they want done. They all agree childcare is an issue. They all, and I mean, this is I think the Conservatives maybe need to take a few more steps on this, but they all know that climate change is a problem. There's a sense that we know what needs to be done, but there is differences in terms of how we go about it. And there's also this sort of competition, this very zero-sum way of thinking that a vote for the other guys is a loss for us. And I think minority government probably exacerbates that and makes it worse because the parties are all concerned about how are we going to protect our space? How are we going to do better in the next election? There's vulnerability around when the next election will come. The Prime Minister wanted to get a majority this time and didn't. Like the other parties don't have the money to go to election again soon. So there's this kind of strange focus on winning that I think creates more division than is really there. And then you look at the Greens, who are in actual survival mode, right, where they're like looking at absolute financial ruin and they don't have a leader and this sort of crisis, right? So like I'm not sure that the party system is, I think it creates more division than is really there.
Well, thank you for that. And I just have to ask, and then I'm going to follow up in a minute with Eleni Bakopanos, but going back to what you said, Professor Turnbull, you're talking about there being a higher level of competition. How does social media play into this? Because we've talked a little bit about the past and how things used to be. Is this ramping up the discourse and the sort of level of taking shots at each other?
I think it does in a number of ways, right? Because people can start making comments on social media that they don't really have to own. You see some comments that there's not, you don't know who is the person behind this account, but there's people with, you know, 1 or 2 followers coming at somebody and making these claims, and it's like, it's very combative and nasty in some cases, and it creates the sense that there's hostility, right? And the kind of like lack of understanding of people's different ideas. It's not a positive conversation, it's just swiping. And that can make things worse, I think. And the other thing is that there's more of I think more on the part of the parties, there's a real need to try to control communications, because you don't want to seem as though you're caught off guard. A party doesn't want to look like we've got a whole bunch of voices talking about different things and they're not unified on something. And so, yeah, like I think social media can totally make it worse.
Thank you, and thank you for that. Eleni Bakopanos, you're with Equal Voice, so you work with all the parties. Tell me, what are your observations? Is there more mudslinging in Canadian politics today? What do you see when you're dealing with various members of different parties? How do folks get along, and are they?
I'm going to talk from the perspective of having been in Parliament for 13 years, where there was always divisiveness on especially the main issues. And I was, when I was in Parliament, we had even more divisiveness, because you had extreme right-wing parties also who were bringing a perspective that hadn't been there in Parliament before, the Alliance Party, and all Western sort of base. So the divisiveness has existed. What is different now is the social media, and I think that has made a huge difference in terms of personal attacks, anonymous, the trolls that political parties have put out also to go after certain people. And I'll use the example of Catherine McKenna, okay, who really, the trolls were after her all the time from the political parties. She had to take a lot of abuse, I'll call it abuse. And what is sad is that when Equal Voice is trying to recruit women to actually run for office, this is what comes up. This is that they may be attacked on a personal level, on a professional level, the way they look, the way they speak. We can even go back to that. There's been statements in the House about the shrill voices or how a woman is dressed. And this comes up very, very often in terms of, why should I enter politics when I will be exposed to this type of abuse? And in Parliament, to also being attacked on a personal level, not because of my views or my values, but just the way I look or the way. And when I was in Parliament, I thought at this point in my life, I wouldn't see any of that. I thought we had outgrown that. And I find, because it is a minority government, to go back to Professor's point, because the stakes are high when you're in a minority government, I think the divisiveness has in fact grown, because we've had 2 minority governments, and that has not helped also in terms of encouraging women to actually enter politics. Maybe men too. I mean, I have to say where I'm coming from, right? Because Equal Voice is women, but I'm sure many men feel the same way.
Well, and I want to stay with you on that, Eleni Bakopanos, because you've touched on something that we've been hearing a lot of, and certainly I know I've been involved in several national and international conversations about this, about women in politics, and that has to be a part of this conversation when we talk about divisiveness and attacks on folks. Has it been your experience to some extent that women are on the receiving end many times, more so than perhaps other politicians of these kinds of attacks?
Well, I think the statistics will prove that. And not only on the national level, not only on the provincial level, but internationally, the IPU does a lot of research, in fact, on harassment of women politicians, both in and out of legislatures. And the statistics are mind-boggling in terms of the percentage of women. 50%, over 50% of the women responded in most countries that answered the questionnaire at the IPU that they were abused or harassed or attacked on social media. That's pretty high when you think about it. So it doesn't encourage, people to enter the political realm, or as I call it, public service. Because to me, politics is public service. It isn't about the games. There is a factor that we need systemic change in terms of how do we run our legislatures. Okay, when you have, for example, last night, we lost at Equal Voice the 100th anniversary celebration for the first woman elected to Parliament. We lost parliamentarians. Why? Because they were sitting debating an emergency debate that was going to go on all night. Is that healthy? Does that lead actually to a healthy environment? No, it doesn't, because by the time you get to midnight or 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, and I know Frank has sat through those, I've sat through many of those, and especially in a minority government where you have to have people there. And let's add the element of the pandemic also as affecting people's health, both mental and physical health at the moment. So you've got quite a few elements which lead to much more divisiveness that I think may not have been there if it wasn't the circumstances under which Parliament is at the present the structure. And so we need systemic change. If we're going to make for healthier environments for everybody, we have to change the hours we sit. We have to give people breaks. Maybe the pandemic helped. I'm sorry, I'm going on. Maybe the pandemic helped because people, MPs were able to work from home, but that added another burden if you have young children.
And another layer.
Yes, another layer. So I think it's been like, boiling and boiling. I hope it's not going to, overblow to the extent that we've got no one talking to nobody in the House of Commons. I hope not, and I pray not.
Well, and thank you for those comments. And really, they go very well into my next question, which goes to you, Frank Baylis. There are better ways to manage the business of politics, and you've certainly touched on some of these in the past. I mean, while we've been talking about the environment to some extent outside, as Eleni said, and as I know you've worked on in the past, there's work that we could be doing in terms of how we manage the business of the House of Commons. You've made some movements in this area. So what do you think needs to happen? How can we improve the situation?
There's so much. I'll touch on a few, but I'll swing back to some point that Eleni brought up about women in politics. The environment is a hyper macho, is a completely unacceptable environment. If you carried on the way you carry on in the House of Commons, in practically any other venue, anywhere else, you would be hauled up in front of a tribunal or something. The behavior is unacceptable. I made a commitment to myself when I got to Parliament that I would never partake in it, but added to that, I would never accept it. And I would never let it become part of how just so many people I spoke to, Frank, it's how it is, you have to accept it. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I think we need to start there and say it is unacceptable. And to Eleni's point as well on the fact of women, my hope was when we were elected in 2015 and there was a whole cadre, 150 of us brand new, that I thought if we're ever going to hit the reset button and say we're going to do politics differently, I thought this is a great opportunity. I thought this was our chance. And also when we say we're opening the door to diversity, to people of different cultures, to more women, we can't say to them, come in women, or come in diverse people and just act like us. Just act like men, be hyper aggressive, it made no sense to me. And unless we can change the environment, as has been touched on, great people don't want to come into this environment, and rightfully so. Rightfully so. So I want to really put that stake in the ground that the environment is unacceptable. It's absolutely, we're not doing our jobs, we're unproductive, and we're paid a salary to govern the country. That's beside the point. But even if we were doing our jobs, the way we're behaving, the way that and what's allowed to transpire has to stop. I have to put my foot down there, and there's so many ways we can do that. But that's the first point, Indira, I really want to put
Well,
very
and
full
let's stay
volume.
with you because Eleni did touch on some of the changes that could happen internally in terms of the House of Commons and how things are done, you know, the hours of the vote and how
Absolutely.
things are managed there. What are your thoughts on that?
Well,
Are
I
there
had
ways?
I had put together motion 231, and what I did with 231 is I read for the last 12 years everybody's suggestions, and there's a ton of great suggestions. Okay, so I want to say I picked what I thought were the low-hanging fruit, like the no-brainers, just the easy stuff. Then I got 2 people from the Conservative Party, 2 people from the NDP, 2 Liberals, and Miss May, and we got together and we started to work on this motion and put down and write it in that. And I was sadly to learn that the leaderships benefit and do not want to see changes. And I mean the leaderships of the different parties. I'm not talking about the general MPs. There's a goodwill and desire for the general MPs, but what you've seen is the power, and it happens in many systems, the power gets more and more concentrated into the center, fewer people make decisions, and they have no interest in sharing the power, changing the system, or anything like that. That we need to come to this acceptance. And what we were trying to do with motion 231, motion 231, was to take power from the center, give some back to the speaker. The speaker's powers have been usurped. Ours is the weakest Westminster system in the world because over time they've crept and taken the speaker's power away. So the speaker, if you behave badly in the House of Commons, in another place, they say, you know what, Indira, you're not talking till you apologize. You better behave or I'm not going to recognize you. Our speaker has to say, well, Indira, you've behaved badly the whole time, but I'm told you're next speaker, so I've got to recognize you. So the speaker, we don't need a speaker right now because all that person does is just say, you speak, but a computer could do that. They're no longer doing their role, and people need to know that. And that happened over time. So that's just one example of a change which give the speaker the power to say, if you continue to behave bad, you're not going to speak. And if you go even more, I'm going to throw you out. Those powers existed. They have been usurped by the center. That's just one example. And I have many of them. But that one there, I thought, why don't we just go back to the way the system was designed? We don't have to reinvent the wheel. This comes from all Westminster systems use that. Our system has been perverted. That's a reset button. Let's just go back to that.
Well, thank you for those comments. And it really makes me think about a couple of things. So you're talking about how things have developed over time. I'm now going to go to Professor Turnbull. Professor Turnbull, I'm curious because Eleni Bakopanos touched on this a bit, and I think Frank did a little bit, but COVID has brought an extra element into how business happens in terms of our House of Commons, with people working remote and the rest of it. How has this really affected the ability to really talk with people, to get along, to form partnerships, and to be able to grow that feeling of camaraderie, and we're here to help Canadians and move the best policies forward? What kind of a layer has COVID and this pandemic put on everything when everybody's working remotely much of the time?
Yeah, it's interesting because we think about Parliament and Parliament Hill and the whole precinct as being a very alive kind of place where there's something very important about being there and being in the hallways and being part of the energy on the Hill. And so it's sort of counterproductive, or not counterproductive, sort of counterintuitive to think about people being separate from that and phoning in from home. It would be a very different experience. I think over the course of COVID, when we saw a hybrid parliament because we had to, I think it was very difficult for the opposition parties to be able to gain any traction on their points because the public pays less attention when you don't have that energy on Parliament Hill in the same way. And so it's hard anyway, I think, for opposition parties to be able to get them, get the energy, get the microphone, get the media to pay attention to them. And I think that only got worse over COVID. I think that during COVID, we saw how, and this is sort of a for better or for worse comment, but we saw how powerful the executive can be on its own. We saw the kinds of decisions that an executive can make without going to Parliament. And some of that is like a beautiful side of Westminster. When there is an emergency, the executive can be strong enough to respond without getting caught up too many times. And we need that. We need the government to be able to say, there's an evolving situation and it's creating a public health crisis and an economic crisis, and we're able to respond, and we can manage the kind of accountability relationship when we have to because it's an emergency. And when we do it, we can see levels of trust go up. You know, like the prime minister, premiers across the country, with a couple of exceptions, were the most popular they ever were, because people start to think about their trust in government as being dependent on responsiveness to need, as opposed to the accountability and the process and all the rest of it. But then eventually that kind of flips around and it goes to politics as usual, and you see trust decline again. I think I am worried about a lot of the systemic issues, and including the one that Frank raised around the role of the speaker, as being tied to an overall dismissiveness of the role of Parliament. We don't see the importance of that role. Therefore, we downplay the need for a strong speaker. We downplay the need for strong committees. We're not protecting all of that. And I'm afraid, frankly, that COVID got us a bit used to a secondary kind of quieter role for Parliament. And it might have created a bit too much, normalization of that. And I'm afraid that we'll just continue, especially like, and I'll try to be quiet in 20 seconds or so, but during a minority period, another way that we dismiss the role of Parliament is to act like minority governments are somehow temporary situations of purgatory that we should get rid of as soon as possible to give the executive back its majority. And that isn't true. And a minority parliament is every bit as legitimate, and it should be every bit as effective as a majority one. I think we have to get some attitudes around accepting the fact that this is fine and that it's good, and that we can see a productive, accountable government even when it doesn't have the majority of seats.
Some very interesting observations by you about how the work is really playing itself out in Parliament right now. However, if you don't mind, just a really quick follow-up to this, because we did touch on COVID, we touched on the remote work. I also wonder about the environment in terms of the larger picture. So certainly in some of the work that I do, you see people not having as much patience as they used to when they're dealing with serious challenges in their lives. Just trying to figure out how to get online by working remotely, trying to deal with working social isolation and the rest of it. Just very quickly, has that added an element, would you say, Professor Turnbull, to the way folks are talking to each other, politicians talk to each other? Is it just ramping up those attacks to some extent?
It certainly could, right? Because I think you're right, like it's happening in workplaces across the country, and Parliament is a workplace. And we're all having to live with this, like creating a work-life balance in a very different way. And even though I think for some people, remote work creates some freedom, it creates choice where it wasn't there before, it creates flexibility. It also creates a terrible burden sometimes, because just because you can run your meetings out of your bedroom or your basement or whatever doesn't mean you want to expose your workplace to your life, and vice versa, right? Like it's not, everybody doesn't want to turn their camera on, and sometimes for very good reasons. And so like it actually does, I think, create a really weird burden that people weren't preparing for, and that's going to affect people differently.
Thank you for that. Eleni Bakopanos, I'm going to go to you now. So we've kind of established to some extent how people are getting along, or not getting along, I should say, Canadian politicians with each other at times, and sort of the divisiveness that's going on. I'd like to talk to you first about how this is actually impacting the broader public, the voter. I mean, to some extent, there's a growing disenchantment, I would say, these days with politicians. Now, many of us who've knocked on doors over the years and so on are sensitive to this, and know at times that people will say, oh, all you politicians are like this or like that. And oftentimes, as we all know, it's very unfair. But having said that, there are times when that disenchantment recently is growing more as these divisions appear to be becoming more obvious, as the comments that are being made in public seem to be below the belt, and those attacks. What's your sense about this? Are there serious issues right now with trust and credibility when it comes to the political arena and politicians in general?
I think, if I may say, there was always a mistrust of politicians. Let's put it out there. There always was. I worked for a long time in provincial politics, and that issue was there. I do want to say recently what I've disliked a lot is that the way when we're doing the leaders' debates, this is a perfect example where they could take the high road, if I may use those words, each of the leaders. And I personally, if I was advising any one of them, I would have said, please take the high road. People watching do not want to hear each leader of the party attacking another leader of the party. They want to hear, what are you going to do for me? What are you going to do for me as a Canadian citizen to make my life better? I'm going to give you my trust, because that's what you're doing when you're voting. You're actually giving your trust to somebody to take care of the issues that you consider important or that should be a priority. And again, the pandemic is a perfect example where the priority should be the pandemic. So the debates, and we saw what happened after the recent debate and the divisiveness that took place between the leaders. So it has to start, in my opinion, at the top. They have to show an example that they can actually talk about issues and not about attacking each other for whatever reason. I don't think the public really has an appetite for that. I know they don't. So therefore the apathy grows. The other end of the issue is youth. How do we motivate another generation? Okay, and we can discuss that for a whole hour, but I won't go into it. How do we motivate another generation who are really not interested in this bickering and fighting, but they want to know, what are you going to do about taking care of the environment? I'll use that as an example, because it's me who has to live in the next 20 years with pollution, with climate change, and all the rest. And somehow I feel they failed. They failed in terms of getting that message out, what each of them are going to contribute to make it a better world for the next generation. So the apathy just keeps growing. If at the top, there are not any role models of civility or in terms of ideas or policies to put forward. And I don't mean that they didn't have any ideas and have policies, but it's not what's, what most of the public don't even read. Let's be clear here. Nobody reads the party platform except the candidates, and half of them don't even read them. They're told, what are your talking points, right, for the election. So you need to have the leaders at the top, because they get all the publicity during a federal election or a provincial election. They have to be the ones to show the example. And I think they failed, personally.
Lots to think about there, absolutely, and some troubling things for sure. Frank Bayless, I'm going to go to you. So we're talking about building more trust and credibility with voters for politicians in Canada. You were a politician. You certainly worked at trying to build that camaraderie amongst people. What do you think we need to do? How can we build that trust with young people, for example, and voters in Canada? Does this run too deep? Can we really fight it?
No, not at all. I'm going to come back to one of the other things that I was trying to change, my motion 231. And again, this idea is taken from other jurisdictions. But one of the ideas is, when you take power from the center, you give some to the speaker, as we talked about, some to the member of parliament, and some to the voters. So to get voter engagement, one of the ideas is that if there is an electronic petition on a certain issue, and they reach, we had a threshold of 70,000 signatures, that they could push something into the House of Commons to be debated. So let's say there's an issue on the table, and we had checks and balances, so you couldn't have anything spurious or silly put in there, and you couldn't repeat something that had already been debated. But let's say the population has something near and dear to their hearts, and enough people sign a petition saying, I want to hear where my elected officials stand on this, and I want to hear this thing debated. Right now, what we do with our citizens is we say once every 4 years normally, tell us how we did or how we're doing, and sign up and then shut up, buzz off. We don't need to listen to you. Whereas this idea, again, it's used in other jurisdictions, and you set a threshold, but it would allow voter engagement where they say, okay, look, I really care about the salmon fisheries in BC, and what I'm hearing about there is very much bothering me. Okay, if there's only 3 of you that care about it, no, you're not going to get that thing debated. However, if there's sufficient enough that we could say across Canada, this is an issue of importance to Canadians, they could push it into the House of Commons. Now, this is done in the United Kingdom. It's been done for, I don't know how many years now. And it is actually very interesting. It is the most listened to debates. As Eleni said, I think most people don't read the platforms or anything like that, or pay attention. But they've found that these things that the people were pushing into Parliament were very well, that voter engagement that we were seeking was there.
Mhm.
And you could imagine how interesting that would be. And again, this isn't a Canadian idea. It's not my idea. It's taking what I thought was very good idea from another jurisdiction and bringing it to Canada.
So taking some of that passion that voters have and allowing them a way and a pathway to be more engaged with the political system that we have. A very, very interesting idea for sure. Thank you. Professor Turnbull, I'm going to go to you because while we talk about divisiveness, we talk about building more constructive politics in our country and better ways to do things so we can actually come up with solutions. You study this stuff, so part of this conversation really does have to deal with the facts and truth. You know, we have seen a lot of things happen over the last little while, especially when it comes to social media. And as some of our other guests have touched on, when you've got third parties posting things, you know, that really there's no way to actually double check whether it's actually truthful or not. When we hear about certain postings being altered or, you know, certainly sometimes even photographs being altered. And what most people these days are getting their news off Facebook, which are a Meta, which, you know, as we all know, is not necessarily a credible news organization and doesn't have all those layers of folks doing their research and doing their homework. How has this affected politics today, and what can we do to solve this issue, would you say? Professor Turnbull?
I did it again. So yeah, like that's a really hard one. And I think we can see governments like in Canada and around the world trying to figure out how to manage misinformation and disinformation. There have always been lies in politics. There is no golden age where we can look back and say everybody was honest and truthful back then and somehow Twitter and Facebook made us spiral out of control. I think this is from an example from American politics. I think it was, you know, presidential race in the 1960s. Somebody said, if they stop telling lies about us, we'll stop telling the truth about them. And, you know, it sort of speaks to the prevalence of just, you know, people will say what they need to say. People will say things that they think will get them elected. And this sort of lack of trust across the board it's sort of normal. There's, you know, if you see some of those surveys where you ask, you know, will politicians say anything to be elected? Oh yeah, definitely. And there's a sense that people think that regardless of who the politician is. But we know, you know, because of survey evidence in Canada and the US and other places too, that when people are exposed to information that ends up being false, it does affect, you know, they have the sense that they can't trust anything. And then what you're more likely to do is start to go to sources that you trust, that you're kind of, you narrow what your exposure is to different sorts of information. You keep coming back to the same sources. And even though they're, you know, perhaps trustworthy in some ways, you're cutting yourself off from different arguments and a kind of cross range of debate and perspectives. Like you just sort of you feel safe in a much smaller category of opinions. And so then are you really informed at the end of the day? And then are you really engaged? Well, no. And you start thinking that the process is going to spit out the same outcome no matter what people do. So a sense of voter efficacy, that elections matter, that campaigns matter, starts to sort of dwindle. And so it's dangerous, right? Like it's dangerous if we go down that road.
And we've seen more and more of that happen, certainly south of the border, in terms of, you know, the conversations that you hear about that are happening in certain chat rooms, people using apps in order to have other conversations, so that when you're looking at the more broader conversation that we may be having in regular ways, there is a whole other discussion going on, and not one or two people at times, that's growing without folks really being aware of it or being able to participate in it. Would you say that's correct?
Yeah, and absolutely. And another thing I would say, like just like across the board, truth is under attack in politics and in democracy here and in the US, even when we're getting to the point that even the former president denying the legitimacy of the results in 2020 and wanting to overturn, you know, ballots that have been cast, and putting pressure on administrators and officials to overturn the results of elections. We're in a very dangerous space if election administration is being questioned by the people who are supposed to accept the rules of the game and are supposed to accept when they lose. Like, that's democracy. When you lose, you deal with it. But if we roll up the consensus on that, then we're in trouble.
Thank you. Frank Baylis, let's just talk about some solutions now. What do you think we can do to build better relations between parties? And is there a role that voters can play in all of this?
I think one of the things we talked about is giving power, taking power from the center. We talked about giving some back to the speaker where it belongs. Talked about giving some to our citizens. The other place I think we need to give power, which would address your question, Indira, is give it back to the members of parliament. Right now, if you're a member of parliament, your best bet to move up or to be seen is to be disruptive, to toe the party line 100%, to attack when you're told to attack, to sit up, vote, sit down, shut up, do whatever you're told, and then you're a good MP. And you know what? I don't need to talk to the opposition to get any deal done because they're irrelevant to me. I'm irrelevant to them. Because again, the centrists usurp the power. Now, if we start to give power back to our members of parliament, again, how the system was designed to do and how it was designed to operate, suddenly I or Eleni or anyone else that's elected says, maybe before I insult that guy on the other side of the aisle or that lady on the other side of the aisle, maybe I should be more polite because I'm going to need their support on some project that I'm trying to push forward. Now I don't have any chance to put anything forward to do anything, so what do I care? I don't need you as a friend. I don't need to be polite to you. I don't have any need or push me to be cooperative. And if we put back in the system the benefit of being cooperative, you'll see the people start to say, you know what, I'm not going to do this. Like, for example, what happens, and I'll give your listeners examples, is that the center will come and say, look, here's a question. I want you to ask a question period. Ask this question. And I would read it and I'd say, no, this is rude. This is insulting. Or you've thrown in a little, it's unnecessary and I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to ask some question where there's always a little dig or that because it's unproductive. Now, I wasn't doing it because I want to move up. I wasn't moving up anywhere. I was just doing it because I'm not going to allow that system to get into me and poison me the way I saw it operate. So I think there's great opportunity and to get people to talk together. And the way to get them to talk together is get them to really work together. Right now, we don't actually work together. We don't have to work together. And that's what Laurie touched upon, is why they hate minority governments, because God forbid in a minority government, you actually have to talk to them or work with them. This is ridiculous. Don't Canadians understand how terrible it is? We need a majority because the last thing we want to do is talk to the other side because they're all the devil. And this is the nonsense that goes on. And it's ridiculous.
Demonizing the other side. A very good observation and point for sure. Eleni Bakopanos, I want to ask you, what do you think needs to happen to bring constructive politics back? And I want to go back to the role also of regular Canadians and regular voters. Is there a responsibility that they have and a role that they can play to encourage more constructive politics, would you say? Eleni?
Okay, sorry, I was muted. You think I know by now. Certainly there is a role, but I think it has to begin very early in life. If I may say something that I say very often, we do not teach young people what are their responsibilities. We teach them what are their rights in a democracy, but they have responsibilities. And that's not to put the burden on them, but if we're going to talk about education, an education system that actually teaches citizens what are your responsibilities as a citizen towards the democratic process and how can you contribute to that, because people, it comes out of ignorance. I have to say that it comes out of ignorance of not knowing our political system, how it works, what's the role of parliamentarians in that system, what are the limits of their power. And so I think education would certainly help in the long run. There are organizations doing great things in terms of educating, for example, the youth.
Right.
Okay? And I can say the Canadian Association of Ex-Parliamentarians, where I am also the vice president, we did have an educational component, but obviously now with the pandemic that has sort of, but we want to do more. along those lines. And I think that will go in the long way when the more people understand the system, the more people know the power also that they have in order to affect change. And that's not taking away with anything that we've discussed. And I do want to go back to Frank's point about members of parliament. Really, the committee system was supposed to be the system where the parliamentarians could affect change to legislation that was being proposed by a minister or a government. I could say, without any reservation, that in my time, and I did chair a committee, we were able to do that to better than we can do it today. I'll say that. We didn't have all the power, but if you could fight the fight and take it then to caucus and explain to people, I've spoken to all the opposition members as the chair, we've agreed to these amendments to the government legislation and convinced the minister, and if the minister didn't agree, by the way, or public servants, I could take it elsewhere. I could take it to caucus, I could take it to leader. I hear it's not the case anymore.
Could I add just
Absolutely.
a little bit? I just want to really underline what Eleni said. It's so true. Our system is designed that we propose a law, and then we take the law and we send it to committee, and all parties look at it, and we bring experts. And experts say, you know what, you've written this, but you better change this and that, because we're not experts in everything. And we make the change and send it back. And guess what? We have to work together there. Now, if you don't do the bidding of the government, they'll just say, you know what, I'll just kick you off that committee. So again, one of the things I was going to change in my motion 231 to say, you're not doing that. You're going to allow us to do the job we're paid to do.
Yes.
It's a simple thing, but Eleni's hit it the nail on the head, and that's giving that power back to the parliamentarians to do their job. And guess what? If I want to convince someone else of my position, then it's probably better off that I haven't been calling that person a name in the House of Commons the whole time.
Yes. Yes.
Might help, you know.
Absolutely.
Sorry to interrupt.
So I want to make sure I'm including you, Professor Turnbull, in this conversation when it comes to constructive politics. Eleni Bakopanos touched on education. That's certainly your area for sure. And it's also having us look to the future about what we can do when it comes to constructive politics. Some of the work that I did in the past involved developing that critical eye in students in order for them to be able to deal with the massive amounts of information they were getting off the internet and to be able to navigate their way through it to sort of figure out, what was really founded in fact and what may not be. Tell me, what do you think that role plays, education and that sort of developing that critical eye with students when it comes to making sure that in the future we have more constructive politics?
Yeah. Oh, that's a really good question. A few things. One thing is, I think we maybe now more than ever, and that's always open to debate about what things were like before, but we need to build the capacity for intellectual self-defense, because there are so many different types of information, including false information, that is very readily accessible by young people, and they know it. And so when a person who has been voting their whole life feels like they're not totally informed and there's lots of information that they haven't processed yet, that kind of sense of civic duty that goes to that sense of responsibility will make them vote more likely than not, even if they're like, I don't really know exactly all the issues, but I'm not going to not vote, I'm going to show up. Whereas a younger person, especially if they haven't voted yet, is more likely to say, there's so much information and I don't know how to process it and I haven't done that work, and so I'm not going to vote. And then that's a self-fulfilling prophecy over time. If you don't vote your first time, you're much less likely to vote in the future. And so how do we equip a person at a young age when you're still too young to vote? We have to make a voter out of someone who is too young to vote. I would also say, lower the voting age. It's okay. You can totally vote when you're 16. And I'm super unapologetic about the fact that I'm totally in favor of that. And I know there's a court case that's snowballing that might be coming up now. But really, if we gave people the opportunity to cast a vote when they were younger, when they were possibly still in school, when they have that civics education, that would create more of a burden on the system to make civics education even better across the board. I think we'd be onto something.
Yeah. So, I'm going to just sort of wind this portion of our webinar up right here, because there are some questions that are coming in from our audience, and I want to make sure that we have time for those questions. So if you folks don't mind, I'm going to go straight to those next. We have about another 5 or 6 minutes before we go into our wrap-up round. So I'm just going to sort of take some of the questions. One of the questions we've had come through right now is, how will we ever make progress when parties are not on the same page on important issues like climate change? For example, how can consensus be built on the extreme urgency of some of these issues? Who wants to take that? Anyone want to jump in there?
Okay. Are we all muted?
No, go ahead, Eleni.
Well, if we take everything we've said so far, we can't. I have to be honest, we can't. Because there isn't a will to be able to come to some consensus. Even though everybody knows climate change is there. Let's be honest, nobody doesn't know. There are some deniers, but generally, there is no way of working together in order to come up with some policy under the present environment to be able to solve that problem. And I don't have a magic wand to know what it is, honestly. Maybe, the professor or Frank have an answer to that, but I don't think under the present climate, there is.
Yeah.
I would like to add something to it, first
Sure,
of all.
please go ahead, Frank.
What people may not know or understand is, I'll put climate change in one little bucket, but as politicians, we agree on almost 90% of everything.
Yeah.
No one goes to Ottawa and says, I want to stick it to senior citizens. Everyone goes, I want to help the senior citizens. No one says, I'm against better education for my children.
For sure.
No one goes there and says, I don't want to create jobs. No one goes there and says, I want to destroy the environment. No one says that. So no one says, I don't want to help families. What do we differ on almost always is priorities. I think this is a priority, or choices that we have to make. I think that's a choice. So should we help the seniors, or should we help families, or should we help the students? We should help everybody, some say. We should help nobody the same. But we actually agree on 90% plus.
So I'm just going to toss this out, and I have another question here from the audience, but just while we're on this track, we're talking about constructive politics. We're talking about the fact that folks are going in so many different directions and attacking each other. Is climate change the issue that could perhaps help everyone come together in their work to improve our lives and help our communities? Is this one of those unifying topics or issues perhaps that we should be looking at when we look at how we develop more constructive politics in our country? And I'm going to go to you, Professor Turnbull, since you haven't chimed in on some of these. I'm going to ask you what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I agree with everyone else. Nobody comes to Ottawa and says, I'm going to be the fly in the ointment. And, but you get there and then the whole thing kind of seems to come apart. We don't have a consensus-based system. We have an adversarial system. Like, by definition, that's what it is. And so coming up with a consensus, like that's the weird part of the system. That's the part I think where it's broken, is you could have a room full of people who agree on most things and somehow it turns into a non-agreement. And so what kind of system does that? But ours kind of does. I don't know that climate change should be the thing that scares the hell out of us all to the point that we have to agree because there's no other choice. But I don't see that really happening either, because there's so many ways to, there's a climate change issue that's essentially a long-term existential emergency. But then there's how it breaks down in the day-to-day. What does it do to particular sectors? How will we rebuild those sectors, which tend to be regionally based? And then you see parties finding wedges to be able to turn parts of the argument against each other. And so then the system reinforces that lack of consensus. And so there we are. Now, over time, it's possible that I hope we'll still make progress on an issue like that. It doesn't mean we won't, but for there to be an emerged political will all around the same stand forward, I doubt it.
Final question from the audience here. Social media has seriously poisoned politics, and it will only get worse, not better. What do you as panelists think? Who wants to take that one? Social media is poisoning the way we get along with each other when it comes to politics, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. Thoughts?
I'd like to just, before we jump, if I could, I'll give your audience one thing. When I was in Parliament, those 4 years, probably the best debate we had, consensus, was on medical assistance in dying. Why is that? Why would we? No one agreed on medical assistance because every single one of us actually has a slightly different opinion. However, what I saw in the debate there was people honestly trying to get their opinion across. Honestly trying to say, look, I think we should allow 16-year-olds this, or I think you should let people pre-choose or not pre-choose. I think I'm worried about this being abused. I really heard great debates when there was something truly to be debated. So it's kind of interesting in terms of I have seen, and I wouldn't say we got consensus at all, but there was a overall consensus and a great debate on trying to find an answer for medical assistance. And so I just put that out there before your social media question, and I'll let others answer that.
No, that's great. That's great and very encouraging. It's good to know that. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say about the social media, I think there's a responsibility also to Meta, all Twitter, and all those companies that are running these social media platforms to be a little more proactive in shutting down people who are consistently using words or attacking in an abusive way. I'll call it abusive way. And I don't think enough has been done to try to bring that under control. We can talk about passing legislation. I'm not sure that's the right way. I would certainly favor legislation being passed, but because it's up to the individual then to take action by deleting. But it goes beyond that. That individual has been weakened by all the abuse and the harassment. So I think to improve how social media is used, we do need some proactive action on the part of the companies that have these platforms. And they have taken some, but very little.
There's some very important comments there. Okay, we're wrapping it up, folks. So I'm just going to go to each of you very quickly. We have about 2 minutes left, and if you can just give me, in your words, any final thoughts that you may have on more constructive politics in Canada. Professor Turnbull, any final thoughts that you have on more constructive politics in Canada and what needs to happen? Sorry,
I think there's a big role for voters. I think there's Oh no. Okay. Now?
Yeah,
we can hear you.
Yes.
Okay. I think there's a big role for voters. I think voters have to demand more from, because we're going to have minority government, I think, for a long time. And the sorts of things that are contributing to the lack of consensus, the lack of stability, the sense of parties are insecure about what kind of vote haul they're going to get, like that's going to continue. So it would be great if we could see, I think, more opportunities for citizens to really be involved in the process, not just voting whenever there's an election. And then you would see more trust in the system and more ownership of the system, and hopefully politicians feeling like, hey, we're not going to be rewarded for acting like jerks. And so let's do something different. Not that they all act like jerks. I'm just saying.
Frank Baylis, final thoughts on the need for more constructive politics in Canada?
First of all, I would say that it's absolutely doable. Do not get discouraged. Don't believe for a second it's always been like this and that lethargy or can't be fixed or that we can't engage our youth or can't. That's all nonsense in my estimation. There's so many things we could do. There's so many things we could make major changes. We can put things back the way they were. We could use electronics to help us go forward in ways. So do not accept at all if people say, throw up their hands and say it's just the way it is. I'm actually very encouraged by all the ideas that I read and saw implemented around the world and people moving towards better democracies. So I would just encourage people to leave with that message.
Thank you. Eleni Bakopanos, thoughts on more constructive politics in Canada and what we need?
I would end it by saying, get into it. If you want to see the change, be the change, as other people have said. And that is part of what we do at Equal Voice. We want people to get into the system. They have ideas, and the system isn't broken because Frank said there are things that we don't have to reinvent the wheel, okay? But it's going to take a new generation of politicians, and I'm not just talking youth, a whole range of politicians to actually get in there and make it happen. So I'll end on that.
Thank you to all of you. It has been a fascinating and very interesting conversation. I learned things today, and it was so good to have you talk about the realities, but also be encouraging for those of us who continue to be engaged in this sector. It's always good to know that there's encouragement and there's there's hope. And so thank you for sharing your thoughts with me. Andrew Cardozo is here now, and I'll turn it over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Indira and Andrew Harris, and thank you for moderating a great discussion on this. I also want to thank you for your ongoing work with us at Pearson in search of better public policy, and for moderating and co-chairing this conference over the last 3 days. This is the last session. This is the end of the conference, and I just want to tell our audience that these sessions will all be posted on YouTube starting tomorrow, and we'll be having a written report coming out shortly as well. So thank you to Eleni Bakopanos for your service to Canada as a member of Parliament.
Thank you.
And perhaps I'd say more importantly, your ongoing service, because you took that experience and continue to work on it, especially in terms of the advancement of women in politics. So congratulations on that. Professor Laurie Turnbull, the work you do as an academic and your commentating and thinking is really important. So I congratulate you for that, and please keep going with that and prodding the system that you keep an eye on so closely. Frank Baylis, you joined the institution of Parliament and you left 4 years later, but it's amazing that you keep a very close eye on how that's going. I think we should thank you for your efforts you did while you were there, but more importantly for your optimism in what can be a better system, because in the end I think we all want to see that happen. This concludes our conference. Thank you to all. And you know what, to the panel, I just say there are a lot of people out there who watched you. The only thing about webinars is you can't hear them applaud you. So what I'm going to do is, as we tune out, I'm going to ask you to applaud each other as we go. So thanks again very much, and please join us again sometime.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.